Because Lake Nyos isn't just any lake. It sits inside a volcanic crater in northwestern Cameroon. And underneath that crater, carbon dioxide from deep inside the earth slowly works its way upward through cracks in the rock and into groundwater. Most of the time, that sounds harmless. Carbon dioxide enters water all the time. Your sparkling water is full of it. The difference is pressure. The deeper you go underwater, the more pressure there is, and the more gas that water can hold without bubbling out. So at the bottom of Lake Nyos, more than 200 meters below the surface, carbon dioxide could dissolve into the water and stay there. And this is where the soda bottle comparison stops being a comparison. Lake Nyos had effectively become a giant bottle of carbonated water, except nobody put a cap on it. The lake did that itself. Its deep water was colder and chemically denser than the water above it, which helped keep the layers from mixing. Fresh water stayed near the surface. Gas-rich water stayed trapped below. And year after year, more carbon dioxide entered from underneath. Think of it like filling a glass from the bottom without ever stirring it. The top can look completely normal while the bottom quietly becomes more and more dangerous. And that's exactly what made Nyos different. There was no smoking volcano beside it, no lava, no ash cloud, no obvious sign that anything under the surface was charging up. By 1986, the deep water was holding an enormous amount of dissolved gas. USGS scientists later estimated the release at roughly 1 cubic kilometer of carbon dioxide. A cubic kilometer. Picture a cube of gas 1 kilometer long, 1 kilometer wide, and 1 kilometer tall. Now put that inside a lake. So the obvious question is what finally opened the bottle. And this is where the story gets frustrating, because almost 40 years later, nobody can point to one trigger and say with certainty, that was it. A large landslide into the lake is one leading explanation. Scientists found fresh rockfall scars around the crater, and a landslide could have pushed deep, gas-rich water upward. But the release may also have been able to start on its own if part of the deep water became saturated enough. And either way, once the first parcel of that water started rising, the exact trigger almost stopped mattering, because the lake had built a machine that could run by itself. As gas-rich water moved upward, the pressure around it dropped. Lower pressure meant the dissolved carbon dioxide could finally form bubbles. Those bubbles made the water lighter. Lighter water rose faster. Rising faster dropped the pressure even more, which created more bubbles, which made the water rise even faster. And suddenly the process wasn't a leak anymore. It was a chain reaction. The closest comparison is opening a shaken bottle of soda, except imagine the bottle is more than 200 meters deep, and the foam doesn't stop at your hand. It keeps pulling more carbonated water up from below. That is the part that turns Lake Nyos from a weird geology story into a disaster. Because once enough carbon dioxide reached the surface, the danger was no longer inside the lake, it was in the air. And carbon dioxide has one extremely unfortunate property for anyone living downhill from a crater lake. It's denser than normal air. So instead of instantly floating away and disappearing into the atmosphere, the cold gas spilled over the edge of the crater and followed the lowest ground it could find. Basically, it behaved less like smoke and more like invisible water. It poured into valleys. It followed river channels. It collected in low spots. And the villages around Lake Nyos were built in exactly those places. Investigators later traced the cloud through multiple valleys. In one direction, it traveled roughly 15 kilometers from the lake. And here's what makes that so much worse. The cloud had no wall, no flames, no color telling you where the danger started. Carbon dioxide itself is colorless and odorless. Some survivors later reported strange smells in the area, but the thing doing most of the killing was something they could not see coming. People inside the cloud were suddenly breathing air with far too much carbon dioxide and far too little usable oxygen. At high enough concentrations, that doesn't give you a dramatic movie scene where you realize what's happening, grab your family and sprint away. It can make you confused, then unconscious, then dead. Hundreds of survivors treated after the disaster described a catastrophe where people had simply collapsed. Some remained unconscious for hours. Investigators found victims and animals lying where they had been when the cloud arrived, and that created one of the strangest patterns in the entire disaster. Height mattered. The gas followed the terrain. Low areas were devastated while places above the dense cloud could be spared. So two people could live surprisingly close to each other, and one could be inside lethal air while the other was above it. It's hard to think of a more literal example of geography deciding whether you live or die. But even after more than 1,700 people were killed, scientists still had another problem. The lake wasn't empty. That first disaster had released an enormous amount of carbon dioxide, but gas from beneath the crater did not suddenly stop entering the water. The system that built the problem was still there, and researchers already had a reason to take that seriously because Lake Nyos wasn't even the first warning. 2 years earlier, another Cameroonian lake called Lake Nyos had released carbon dioxide and killed 37 people. At the time, that event was bizarre. After Nyos, it looked like a pattern. So now scientists had a lake that had already killed more than 1,700 people, was slowly reloading itself, and could not simply be drained without creating a completely different disaster. The solution they came up with looks almost too simple: a pipe. In 2001, engineers lowered a pipe from the surface of Lake Nyos down into the gas-rich deep water. Water was brought upward through it, and once that water rose far enough, the pressure dropped, carbon dioxide began bubbling out, and those bubbles made the water inside the pipe lighter, which pulled more deep water upward. In other words, the exact runaway physics that made the lake dangerous could now be used to make it safer. Once started, the system could drive itself. The lake was basically allowed to slowly open its own bottle, but this time through a controlled straw. The result was a fountain of gas-rich water that could shoot tens of meters above the lake. And because one pipe wasn't removing the carbon dioxide fast enough, two more were later added. Over time, the amount of gas stored in the deep water dropped dramatically, which finally answers the last obvious question. Could Lake Nyos do this again? Not in the same way it could in 1986. Controlled degassing has reduced the gas to much safer levels, and later work found that a continuously operating pipe could be used to balance the carbon dioxide that naturally keeps entering the lake. But that answer comes with an uncomfortable footnote. The earth underneath Lake Nyos never agreed to stop producing carbon dioxide. The danger didn't disappear because the geology changed. It became manageable because humans learned how to continuously remove the gas before nature could store enough of it again. And that's probably the strangest part of the entire story. A volcano didn't erupt on August 21st, 1986. There was no river of lava moving toward a village. There wasn't even a poisonous chemical humans had never seen before. The killer was carbon dioxide, one of the most ordinary gases on Earth, stored in ordinary water until pressure, depth, and time turned the lake into something nobody living around it could see. And after the cloud passed, the lake was still there. Quiet. No giant crater had been blown open. No mountain had disappeared. From a distance, it could look like the same lake it had been the day before, except entire villages below it had gone silent. That's what makes Lake Nyos terrifying. The disaster wasn't hidden because nobody bothered to look. It was hidden because almost everything dangerous about it was underneath the surface. And sometimes, the most dangerous thing in the landscape isn't the thing that looks threatening. It's the thing that looks completely normal. If you want more stories about ordinary things hiding very unordinary ways to kill you, subscribe. Because Lake Nyos didn't need fire, lava, or even a visible cloud to become one of the deadliest lake disasters ever recorded. It just needed a bottle nobody knew was being filled.